Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. One thing I really like to talk about on this channel is class design. If I was given the job of designing for Dungeons and Dragons, how would I redesign classes for any future iteration of the game? And as I say that, I believe that Dungeons and Dragons is still looking for a chief of game design, so hit me up. Anyway, what are the guiding principles that I use when considering class creation? I made a list and I'd like to go through some of the basics of them. The first one is, how is the class useful inside and outside of combat? There are at least three primary pillars to the game. There's combat, social and exploration. Perhaps pursuit should be considered a separate tier from exploration. That's negotiable for now, but definitely combat, social and exploration are the three most important parts of the game. And for Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps combat is the single most important one. But how should all classes be useful outside of combat? There are some classes that easily make a case for themselves. Rogue's ability to sneak and steal and pick locks and bypass traps make it really useful outside of combat. Bard's high charisma, social skills, performance ability, and spell list make it really useful in social encounters and pretty much everywhere else as well. But what about barbarian or fighter? How many times have you been at a table either playing one of those classes or watching someone else twiddle their thumbs as the scene doesn't really involve them? I've seen this happen at the highest level tables, professional live play events where a single player is kind of taking a back seat during an episode because that's not really what their character's for. Now, for some players, that's absolutely fine. They don't have a problem with that. They're there for the fighting and they enjoy it. And when they're not fighting, they're happy to listen along to the story and let everyone else take the limelight. I think that's somewhat of a wasted opportunity. I think everyone should be involved in the story at all times. And certainly there are going to be points where some players have a more important role than others. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But to sit out an entire pillar of the game because that's not what my character's good at feels like a waste. So how can we get the barbarian and the fighter to be useful and engaged in a social situation? How can we get the squishy wizard more involved in an exploration with traps? How can we make sure that all players have an opportunity to engage in the game in all pillars of play, even if they're not going to be the rock star at that moment? But how can we make sure they can still contribute? That's one thing that needs to be baked into class design. Classes should have features that allow players to be engaged at all time. Another thing is, how can this class contribute to the team? There are plenty of classes that have a strong teamwork contribution built in, and this is especially true in combat. If you look at paladins with their aura, if you look at clerics with their healing, if you look at bards with their inspiration, they're always helping everyone out. I think Dungeons and Dragons needs to pivot somewhat so that it's more of a team-based game. More classes need to have features which don't just benefit themselves. Something I've talked about in previous videos is changing Hunter's Mark to be a team-based buff. Once a ranger puts Hunter's Mark on a target, they get bonuses against that target. But maybe everyone else should as well. This is the ranger pointing out a particular target as a priority. Bring it down, everyone! And getting the team to contribute together. Having each class, or most classes, have some sort of team-working buff that people can use to work together, I think would add a lot to gameplay and add a lot of enjoyment. Sometimes you get a turn when you don't seem to do much, but if you're helping other people on their turn as well, you can see the active contribution that your character is making. I think that's a very important part of the game. Another consideration, and this is a really important one for me, is giving players choice. A lot of Dungeons and Dragons choices at the moment are what I call meta choices. They're choices about the character rather than choices the characters get to make in gameplay. If you have a look at the weapon list in Dungeons and Dragons, there are dozens and dozens of choices of weapons for players. But this is something that you choose when designing your character. There are very few choices players make actually during combat. They normally have a best weapon and a best equipment setup, and they will use that in every circumstance because it's what they're best with. Encouraging players to actually go, should I be using my scimitar or my hammer against this target, adds an element of gameplay which I think would be well received. Give players options in combat, in the game. Make them so that there's no obvious right choice. Make it so that there are contextual clues that would certainly hint at what could be better, and make the choices matter. Giving players choice in-game is more important than giving them choice in character creation. So that's in-game choice versus meta choice. Another thing that I've brought up in other videos is what I call a character class matrix. This is an idea that's inspired by things like Paladin, Cleric, and Warlock, where they kind of already have two subclass choices to make. For a Cleric, it's which domain do you want to be part of, and which god do you want to follow. Now, in all honesty, at the moment, the god a Cleric follows makes almost no difference to the game. It's really just a character and storytelling device. But if each god came with its own pantheon of special spells and abilities, and each domain had a different set of spells and abilities, you could pick a domain and a god and have a much bigger choice of abilities to use in-game. The same goes with Paladin. What oath are you making, and who are you making that oath to? Warlocks already get to do this. Another reason why I love them. You can pick the nature of your pact and who you've made that pact with. Sure, there are some choices that go together more often than not. Pact of the Blade and Hexblade is a very popular combo, but it doesn't always have to work that way. So, why not do this for all classes? Why not give each class a little table with two different types of subclass to choose from, and give every player this level of flexibility and choice with their character? Another mechanic I want to introduce is something called class actions. Now, Mike Mills has spoken about his disdain for bonus actions, and he says it's justified because he invented them. The problem was that so many special abilities could be triggered at the same time, and they wanted to limit that. So they said, let's have them cost a bonus action. You can only make one per turn, and therefore you can only use one special ability. This has worked and not worked at the same time. Perhaps a better solution is something called class actions. Each class has a specific action associated with it, and this may be a modification of an existing action. For example, if you're a wizard, you have a different version of the magic action. So when you take the magic action, it works differently for you. If you are a fighter, you have an action called Action Surge, and that modifies the way the attack action works. If you're a rogue, you have a sneak action, which you can then take a regular action and then modify some things with it. You get some extra options regarding sneak attacks, hiding, dashing, disengaging, and so on. What this means is that as you can only take one action, you can't mix and match class actions. You can't do all the cool stuff a wizard does whilst also doing all the cool stuff that a fighter does, even if you're a fighter-wizard multiclass. It means you have to choose. This is also something that's nice to scale and power up. As you progress through your character, you are progressing what your class action allows you to do. So there's plenty of nice opportunities for growth. In addition to that, different subclasses could interact with your class action in different ways. So there's a nice potential mechanic in there for character leveling up and character design and subclasses. It also limits how multi-classing works. And let's be fair, this is some of the most abused mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons. I really enjoy seeing what horrific combos people can think of by combining the special abilities from different classes together. I really enjoy Colby from D4 explaining how he can do 300 damage in a single turn by creating a smoothie with 4 different subclasses mixed into it. Perhaps that's not the way most people want to play Dungeons and Dragons. Sure, it's fun for some people, but I think it devalues what each class is special for if you start mixing it that way. So having a class action is a way to somewhat limit the multi-class soup that a lot of people, including myself, I'm not casting any aspersions on people here, I'm guilty of this as well. Perhaps we should tone it down a notch. One other thing I like to think about with multi-classing is, should this ability be a modification to a core rule, or should it be its own mechanic? Now, there are good examples for both of those, and I actually think including a mix and match of the two is important. Wizards primarily use a standard set of rules with a few modifications added to it. They use spell slots the same way as everyone else, but they have arcane recovery to get a few back. Sorcerers, on the other hand, use magic in a completely different way. Their sorcery point mechanic is a different resource that can be tracked, and it interacts with spell slots and the way you cast spells in very different ways. Warlocks are a lot closer to wizards. Sure, they only regenerate spell slots, a few spell slots on a short rest, but other than that, they cast magic in pretty much the same way. So you can compare a modification to an existing mechanic versus a new mechanic with a new resource to track. I actually like the idea that most classes should have some sort of class resource associated with it, and some way to earn it back that isn't just resting. I really like Bardic Inspiration because it's a very versatile resource that can be used in lots of different ways. But unfortunately, the only way to get it back is to take a rest. And that creates a sort of conservative gameplay where you're not willing to use these resources on the off chance that you're going to need them later. Having a mechanic where you can earn these resources back through some means other than resting allows a continuation of gameplay and a more engaged use of these resources. So should each class have both, some way to modify existing mechanics plus its own mechanic and resource? I think so, yeah. I think that would be a nice thing to do, and it would make each class feel quite different from all the other classes. And that's what we want. We want to have classes be different enough that each engage with a different classic fantasy trope or power fantasy. So yeah, let's have classes sometimes modify existing rules and sometimes use their own rules and resources. I love talking about different classes. I've actually got an idea, a modification for my idea about fighters. I've been talking about fighters in lots of previous videos because they're just one of the core classes, and I don't think they handled particularly interestingly at the moment. But I'll save the fighter discussion for another video. Let's see when that comes out. So those are my thoughts on character design and class design for Dungeons and Dragons. I'd love to hear if I've missed anything out. I probably have. Please do remind me. But what do you think about when you think about class design for Dungeons and Dragons? Let me know and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.